Hello, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5 of Limitless. The Federal Reserve takes on a new age of crisis. And pretty much the whole idea of this chapter was kind of the redefining of the power and the role that the Fed plays in the government. And this was mostly defined by the work of Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. And the Federal Reserve began as a much more secretive institution um, that kind of just acted in the background. Um, but as time went on, and as these changes were made, we see that it became a lot more well known, a lot more publicized, and its um, different powers continue to grow. So initially, the Fed operated pretty much completely in secret. And the idea behind this was that too much public knowledge would potentially change how they would make their decisions and change um, like any possible public outrage or public opinions that would eventually affect market decisions. And they wanted to operate kind of strictly off of the idea of um, whatever they discuss is a lot more kind of bipartisan. But the people and a lot of politicians were actually against this. One example is Henry Gonzalez. He was a Texas Democrat, and he was very opposed to the secrecy of the Fed. The book starts with kind of interactions between him and the Fed chairman at the time, who was Alan Greenspan. Um, so even though Greenspan was very focused on keeping meeting records private, eventually things did change, and the Fed, as we know today, is a lot more transparent. So the chapter begins with a quote from Alan Greenspan where he says that the issue which must be resolved indeed has to be is the balance between accountability, which is essential in a democratic society, and effectiveness of monetary policy. So this goes into our misconception because a common misconception is that following all these changes and this change in transparency of the Fed, that it became just super accountable, um, and that wasn't necessarily the case because just like in the quote says, they still had to balance their the effectiveness of their monetary policy. So what this means is that yes, they became more transparent, but it wasn't necessarily it didn't bring the level of accountability that a lot of critics wanted. For example, the book talks about, and this was bipartisan, but the book talks about Bernie Sanders specifically, who was um, very, very strong in his desire to, get the audit of the Fed. And his main gripe was pretty much that even, with the increased transparency, that a lot of this information was going to these financial markets and the investors. So pretty much a lot of the financial benefit was going to these big companies and these big corporations, and people that already had a lot of money and already had a lot of stock and capital. But his argument was that this increase in transparency should come with an increase in accountability and kind of make it so that there was a lot more public oversight and that everyday Americans could kind of have more of a say and kind of be more aware of how everything operates.
How's it? My name's Kanai, and my chapter was chapter 5. The temple is under new management, and this mainly focuses on the shift that happened inside the Federal Reserve. So, because the new generation came into these jobs and replaced these other people. It changed the mindsets of how people thought. The leadership was different, so it had different style of leadership and how it was ran, and the role that this Federal Reserve played in the economy and towards the finance of the world. And one of the biggest ideas of this chapter is the new management, as I said, the leadership and how they thought and how they brought new thinking into it, as of how they should respond to the economic problems of the world, and how the rules that they had and strategies they had to help with the financial part of the economy. Another big idea or point that was in there was how the Federal Reserve was able to be more active in the economy and get out there more. So another thing was that instead, how they say in the old days, they were just adjust the interest rates for the financial or to help the financial market or change the financial market. The new generation, because of their new ways of their mindsets and thinking, they actually got more involved. They were able to buy some government bonds. They were able to buy assets, and this changed the way they help the financial market in the world. And it also explains the shifts of the this Federal Reserve's priorities, and how it was mostly the traditional was mostly about inflation, controlling it, making it stable, make sure the finances and people are good. And the new people or the next generation was about more important of people being employed, having jobs, and the recovery that they had from the high inflation, the high numbers of prices for needs, due to the fact that they changed their priorities and made it more about employment. um, this made it so that they were willing to have higher inflation if it meant having more people employed and getting jobs. And then also in this chapter, it was clear that the changes that this new generation had adapted to or wanted the Fed to adapt to was not simple, and not everybody agreed to it. This was and it talked about how there were debates within the Fed and how policymakers were scared or worried about the new actions and new priorities that this new group was taking on, because they thought that it was risky and it could have caused maybe like a problem for the future or something that would be bad for the generations to come in the future. And then another idea was that the Fed wasn't just reacting to one crisis that we had in the financial market, but it was also preparing for the new kind of economic reality we have. Because as you see, the old people were leaving their jobs, and then the new generation was taking them. So this would cause a new kind of system, more people to adapt to this system, and then that's what they were had it to prepare for, and they needed everybody to understand that. So that was another challenge they needed. Um, and this is why in this Ch.5 it's like a turning point, is because the Fed is changing. Everything in the Fed is turning. It's not the same. Everyone's adapting to new things, and it's they're no longer, they have new leadership, they have new tools, they no longer have the same routine. And the main takeaway is that the Fed Reserve is they're not thinking about their old ways because of the new generation. They think different because not everyone's going to think the same. So now they're willing to adapt to these new steps that this generation is showing everybody what they could be doing now for the financial market, and go away with the old and come with the new and see where that takes it. Mahalo. And what was different from this old generation and this new generation coming up was their priorities, their mindset, because the old one was just about inflation. How do we lower it? How do we get the prices down? How are we able to make things more affordable for these people? But this new generation was like, it's okay to have high prices because we want to mainly focus on jobs and the economy. So if the inflation was high, that was okay because they were willing to have it high if that meant more people were getting jobs and making money, so they would be able to provide the food for themselves by paying for these jobs, or getting these jobs and being able to pay for the food.
All right, so this is a chart from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and when we look at this, we can pretty much see specifically the changes by Janet Yellen. So what we know about Janet Yellen is that during her time as Fed chair, she did a lot of emphasis on employment. Employment was a big um, point of her entire tenure as Fed chair. So the time she was Fed chair was around 2014 to 2018. So when we look at this chart, right, we can see that, obviously unemployment is very high over here. This is around 2008, the recession, and it peaks shortly after, but then we see it to start to decline and decline and decline. But right over here, when Janet Yellen becomes the Fed chair, with her huge emphasis on employment, we look at the unemployment rate and it just slowly, slowly, slowly falls until around over here, where it's kind of at the lowest rate it's been for a long time, lower than it was prior to the 2008 recession. And then obviously it spikes over here by around COVID. But over here we can kind of look at this pattern and this trajectory of lowering unemployment, and this is all because of changes that Jenny Yellen was making during her tenure. And it kind of shows you how the decisions of the Fed chair can directly impact things like this, the unemployment rate, and how their own sort of ideals can be so powerful.
Our group's main argument is that the Federal Reserve evolved from a highly secretive institution into more a transparent one, and that this shift was driven by new leadership that redefined what power meant in monetary policy. For most of its history, the Federal Reserve operated with very little transparency. Leaders like Alan Greenspan believed that being vague actually made the Fed more effective. For example, Greenspan avoided clearly defining price stability, which meant that the market and the public often had to guess what the Fed's goals really were. The idea that the Secretary gave the Fed more flexibility and independence. However, this approach began to change under Ben Bernanke. As the book explains, Bernanke believed that transparency could actually strengthen the Fed's power rather than weaken it. He introduced the regular press conferences after policy meetings, which had never been done before, and began explaining the Fed's decisions directly to the public in real time. One of the most important changes came in 2012, when the Fed formally adopted a 2% inflation target. This was a major shift because it replaced vague language with a clear, measurable goal. According to the book, this gave the public financial markets a concrete benchmark, making the Fed more accountable and more predictable. The 2008 financial crisis also played a key role in accelerating the shift. During the crisis, the Fed used unprecedented tools like emergency lending programs and large-scale bond buying to stabilize the financial system. Because these actions were so extreme, the Fed had to communicate more openly to justify what it was doing. The book shows that this moment forced the institution to become more transparent, since maintaining public trust became essential. Janet Yellen continued and explained these changes. She was known for being especially clear and deliberate in her communication. Yellen emphasized that transparency itself was a policy tool, that if people understood the Fed's goals and trusted its intentions, those policies would be more effective. She also pushed the Fed to focus more on employment, especially for marginalized groups. showing that the Fed's roles was broader than just controlling inflation. Overall, the book demonstrates that Fed's shifts towards transparency was not just more about sharing information, it represented a deeper change in how power worked within the institution, instead of relying on secrecy. Leaders like Bernanke and Yellen showed that the Fed could influence the economy.
So, one takeaway we can have from this chapter is understanding the role of the Fed and what their goals are. So, specifically, we hear about the dual mandate and this 2% inflation goal. Well, in this chapter, we kind of learn um, where it comes from and why there's a 2% inflation goal. Especially, some people might wonder why we want any level of inflation, but the chapter explains pretty well that the 2% inflation goal can help keep us from the bad effects of high inflation. And the Federal Reserve also focuses on maintaining high employment or as much employment as possible.